Hi, my name is Carrie McLaren. I'm the parent of a second grader at PS 118 in Brooklyn and a volunteer for NYC Opt-Out. Now, those of us who organize this meeting are not against testing generally. We're not even necessarily against standardized tests. What we're concerned about are the stakes, the high stakes that are attached to these tests. So what are these tests? Well, high-stakes testing first took off about 14 years ago. And the rationale behind it on a national level is this fear that American students are falling behind students in other countries. Politicians and business leaders say that our public schools aren't as good as schools in other countries, and so they want to do something about it. Now, whether you think our schools are worse than those in other countries or not is not our focus here. What's at issue is how this problem is being solved. Because even if you agree that schools need to be reformed, there are many ways you could try to do that. But here in New York State and in the United States, more broadly, we have focused on standards and testing as a key solution. Our leaders say that the way to improve our schools is to implement standards and to use tests to make sure that teachers and schools meet those standards. And they say it's particularly important for schools serving low-income communities and people of color. Now, who is saying this? Well, some of the most notable include George and Jeb Bush, Bill Gates, the Walton Foundation, which is basically the Walmart Family Trust, the Chamber of Commerce, Governor Cuomo, President Obama, and then we've got testing companies such as Pearson. So how does all of this affect us locally? Well, federal law requires children in grades 3 to 8 to be given annual state exams in English and math. These aren't the kind of tests that you used to take in school. Those tests had no stakes attached, and they were diagnostic. Diagnostic testing helps teachers identify student strengths and weaknesses, places where they need to improve, or in some cases, places where the curriculum may need to be improved. This kind of testing is crucial in education. No one wants to do without it. But the state tests have very little, if any, diagnostic value. In other words, they don't help teachers teach. The results come in the following summer, which is too late to be useful to your child's teacher, and teachers can't view the test. If something on the test happens to catch their eye, they're not allowed to discuss it with anyone, even fellow teachers or the principal. And since teachers aren't supposed to view the test, there's no protocol for them to report any errors on the test. Now, it didn't used to be this way. This started in 2011 when New York State signed a $32 million contract with Pearson. And as a condition of the contract, Pearson demanded security. The company says that keeping the test questions a secret makes it cheaper to develop the test because then they can reuse the questions from one year to the next. If they release the test every year, then they'd have to create a new test from scratch, and Pearson says that would just be too expensive. So the tests aren't really used to help teachers teach. What are they used for? Well, the 4th and 7th grade tests are used for admissions in certain middle and high schools. Each school has its own rules, and some schools use scores and some don't. All schools have protocols for how to deal with students that don't have state test scores, and that could be because the student opted out or because the student came from a private school. Most private schools don't make their students take these tests, in part because they're considered poor quality tests, and we'll have more to say on that later. Usually, if a student doesn't have scores, a school will rank things like report cards and attendance higher. Test scores in 3rd, 5th, 6th, and 8th grade are not used for admissions at all, and they should have no stakes whatsoever for students currently. So then why do all of these students take the tests? Well, the scores are used to evaluate teachers in schools. A teacher's evaluation is shaped by student test scores, even in subjects she doesn't teach. For example, science and Spanish teachers may be rated based on their students' math and English scores, even though they have nothing to do with teaching these subjects. Now, according to a law that Governor Cuomo passed last year, school districts are prohibited from using other evidence of student development, things like student work or curriculum that the teachers have written, student and parent surveys, ongoing classroom observations. None of this can be used to determine or judge teacher quality. Instead, the state law is focused on test score growth. Now, what is growth? Well, growth means that a teacher's students do better on tests the year they have that teacher. Now, some parents may think, oh, my child's going to do well on the test, and that's going to be good for the teacher and good for the school. Well, it's true that high scores reflect well on the school, and in part that's because so many people believe that high scores make a good school. But it's not true for the teacher. A student who gets a high score doesn't have much room for growth. And so teachers of high-performing children are actually statistically disadvantaged. It's a sort of ceiling effect. If a student gets a near-perfect score in 3rd grade, then she needs to get an even better score on the 4th grade test, or her teacher's rating is going to suffer. What's wrong with rating teachers by student test scores? Well, perhaps the main thing is it leads to more worksheets and more test prep. Schools cut art and they cut PE and they cut social studies because the standards for math and English are so detailed that they won't be able to cover everything unless they do cut this stuff. If you're a teacher and you want to keep your job, you've simply got to focus on these tests. Even if you're teaching special ed students, even if your students are English language learners, even if you think that drills and worksheets are confusing or a waste of time. Now think about what this means. It means that we're taking away teachers' ability to make decisions about what they're teaching. And it means we're not treating them like professionals. So another effect of rating teachers by test scores is the fact that it lowers teacher morale. A national study by the NEA found that nearly half of all teachers have considered leaving the profession due to this focus on testing. Applications for teachers' colleges are down across the U.S., and in many cities there are massive teacher shortages. Another thing that rating teachers by test scores does is it deters teacher collaboration. Teachers' test score rating is based on a bell curve. In other words, teachers are compared against one another. So if you're a teacher, the worse other teachers do, the better it is for you. Under this system, a 5th grade teacher has little incentive to make sure that her incoming students do well in the 4th grade tests because that would just make her job harder. Now, I don't know a single teacher who actually thinks this way, I'm not going to help Johnny because that's going to hurt my score. But if you follow the system to its logical conclusion, that's where it takes you. So why are we evaluating teachers this way? Well, let's go back to our stated problem. When politicians say that schools are failing and that standards and testing are the fix, they're talking about personnel. Governor Cuomo and others have complained repeatedly that too many teachers are rated as effective. They say 75% of students are failing the state tests, so a lot of teachers must be at fault. No child should ever be stuck with a bad teacher. I personally would love to see some kind of reform plan put in place to ensure that all children have excellent, well-prepared, engaged teachers. But that's not what this does. The National Academy of Sciences, the American Statistical Association, the American Education Research Association, and the National Academy of Education, they all say the same thing. These kinds of test-based evaluations simply don't work. They're bad data. They're not reliable. Perhaps the most obvious evidence is the fact that results aren't stable. In New York State, a teacher rated effective based on test scores one year is quite likely to be rated ineffective the following year. A third of all teachers move in at least one category. Only 16% are rated highly effective 2 years in a row. Now, when you think of an amazing teacher, do you think that teacher is substantially less amazing the following year? Is she just randomly mediocre every few years? But this happens all the time under test-based rating systems. And this isn't just happening in New York. Here's a photo of a press event in Albuquerque where several effective and highly effective teachers burned their evaluations. One teacher said she was burning hers because the teacher who mentored her, who she considered a brilliant teacher, got an ineffective rating. New York's testing system was not created by educators. It was created by these state and federal laws. It was created by politicians and the special interests who lobby those politicians. For example, there's a group called Families for Excellent Schools. It's an AstroTurf group. They hire parents to be protesters. This is their public face, but this is the private face. This is the reality. And you can read up about them. We've included some links on our website. But groups such as this, pushing for testing and pushing for school privatization, they were by far the single biggest lobbying sector in New York State in 2014. Now, we can go back to that original rationale for testing, the argument that U.S. students are falling behind those in other nations. Well, none of the nations with higher performing students evaluate teachers in this way. Not one. Not Finland, not Japan, not even test-loving China or South Korea. And none of the countries do annual standardized testing for kids this young either. Cuomo and other politicians see schools as businesses and the education system as a market. These leaders are primarily concerned about cutting costs. If you want to improve teacher quality, you could improve teacher training. Finland and Japan, which arguably have among the best school systems in the world, have extremely thorough and rigorous teacher training programs. But that's expensive. And when Cuomo and other politicians talk about reforming schools, they mean cheaply. In both the United States at large and in New York City, government funding for education has been dropping since 2007 with the rise of high-stakes testing. So here in New York, What does that mean? Well, it means the class sizes have grown over 27% for grades K to 3 since 2007. We're even seeing class sizes of 35. We've got increased school crowding. Over a third of elementary schools are well above capacity. Many lack not only gyms and auditoriums, but they have introduced things like the 9:40 a.m. lunch due to lack of space. A good standardized test, like any good tool, it needs to be a reliable, steady gauge. If your bathroom scale says that you weigh 130 pounds one day and then 160 pounds the next, that's not a reliable scale. Throw that scale away. But if you want to see a good standardized test, you can look at the NAEP. Now, you may have heard this argument that we need to have these new tests in order to compare different groups of students in different states. Well, the NAEP has been doing this since 1992. It compares the performance of children across states and on every measure that you possibly want: race, economic class, gender. Lack of data is not the problem. For instance, we've known for decades that poor school districts perform poorly. We've known that their buildings are more crowded and more likely to have major health and safety violations. We've known that teachers in poor schools are less educated, are paid less, and have higher turnover rates. Simply measuring how well schools do is not a solution. If you get on a scale and it tells you you're overweight, it doesn't help you lose that weight. So another thing I want to point out about the NAEP is that it's pretty reliable. There are no high stakes attached to it, so the results are pretty straightforward from year to year, and those slight variations indicate areas where research may be useful. This contrasts sharply with the New York state tests. Note the huge leaps and jumps with the state tests. The reason these results are so scattered is because of the stakes attached to these tests. These are political tests. Scores across the state rose when it was politically expedient for them to rise in order to continue to receive federal funding, and then they dropped when it was politically expedient for them to drop, when the dominant story became about failing schools. The passing scores on the state tests are determined after students take the test. State officials can decide to pass or fail as many students as they like merely by changing the cut score. One year, a 63% was needed to pass. Another year, 87% was needed to pass. And when you have politicians instead of educators setting up your state testing system, what do you think those tests are going to look like? Well, even without looking at the test, you can assume one thing. Those tests will be produced as cheaply as possible. And so it should come as no surprise that the tests are bad scales. In 2014, 557 New York State principals signed a letter describing problems with the test. Now, you can read the whole letter online, but one point I want to share here, and that is ambiguous questions appeared throughout the exams. Many adults could not agree on the correct answers. And you could see this reflected in media reports. Another thing that principals mention is the fact that the tests are just too long. The third grade tests alone are twice as time consuming as the SAT, although unlike the SAT, they take place over a period of days. And here's a quote from the principal of PS 321. "We are truly devastated by what a terrible test it was and how little it will tell us about our students. Our teachers and administrators feel that this test is an insult to the profession of teaching and that student scores on it will not correlate with their reading ability." Of all the claims made about high-stakes testing, the most harmful of all is this idea that high-stakes tests will somehow benefit low-income students or people of color. Since the rise of high-stakes testing in New York 14 years ago, there's been no narrowing of the achievement gap. It's only grown wider. Wealthy communities pay relatively little attention to these tests. They continue to fit in art and recess and social studies. They talk about building 21st century skills, creativity and problem solving and critical thinking. Children in high poverty schools, on the other hand, must focus day in, day out on low-level test prep. These drills and worksheets key to these idiotic tests that most effectively teach them how to hate school. So in closing, we should be skeptical of leaders who say that the way to improve our schools is through high-stakes testing. If you want a school system that can compete with other high-performing countries, there are many things you could do. You could change the way schools are funded and combat inequity. You could limit class sizes. You could improve teacher training. You could focus on project-based learning and 21st century skills. But instead, we parents have been given a very simplistic solution. And that's why we're opting out. We're boycotting these tests as a way of saying loudly and clearly that this is a false solution.